Nobody in Washington knew it was coming. Nobody in Moscow expected Israel to actually cross this line. When Israeli F-35s penetrated the air defense layers surrounding Bushehr and struck the nuclear facility that Russia had built, staffed with its own engineers and publicly guaranteed would be protected, every calculation in this conflict changed simultaneously. Trump went pale. Putin signed orders, the Black Sea Fleet started moving, and the gap between what Israel had modeled as Russia's response and what Russia's response actually looked like began widening in ways that no pre-strike planning document had prepared anyone to manage. The decision to strike Bushehr emerged from a specific strategic assessment rather than from impulsive escalation. Israeli military planners had been watching the conflict's trajectory move in directions that the operations they were conducting were not reversing. Iranian missile production was continuing. Interceptor inventories were depleting faster than they could be replenished. Russian S-400 deliveries had made future strike campaigns progressively more costly, and the nuclear program, the original justification around which the conflict's strategic logic had been organized, was advancing behind Russian protection. The conclusion Israeli planners reached was that the constraint treating Bushehr as an inviolable threshold needed to be revisited against the evidence that the strategic situation on the restraint side of that threshold was worse than they had initially assessed. Bushehr was not simply Iranian infrastructure, it was Russian investment. A facility Moscow had constructed, fueled with Russian nuclear material, staffed with Russian technical personnel, and publicly described as being under a form of protection whose credibility depended on it never being successfully struck. The diplomatic infrastructure surrounding the facility represented decades of Russian effort to demonstrate that Moscow could serve as a reliable partner for states seeking civilian nuclear capability. That demonstration's value depended entirely on the protection guarantee being real. When Israeli aircraft penetrated the air defense layers surrounding Bushehr and delivered precision munitions against its infrastructure, they were not simply striking a building. They were challenging the credibility of the guarantee that Russia had staked its regional positioning on, and doing so in a way that every government in the region was observing and incorporating into its own assessment of what Russian protection actually meant in practice. Netanyahu's authorization reflected a strategic logic built on a specific assumption about how Russia would respond, that Moscow, despite the symbolic cost of watching a facility it had built take direct hits, would calibrate its response to avoid direct military confrontation with American-backed forces. Russia had consistently demonstrated across the conflict's preceding phases that it wanted to manage escalatory risks carefully. The assumption was that the Bushehr strike would produce a response that remained within that established pattern. Loud rhetorically, limited operationally. The fleet movements that began appearing in satellite imagery within hours suggested that assumption was being tested against a Russian assessment that was considerably less accommodating than the pre-strike planning had anticipated. The Russian operational response communicated its significance more clearly through what military assets were doing than through anything diplomatic channels were saying. Moscow's public statements followed the established pattern, measured language expressing grave concern, references to international law governing civilian nuclear facilities, demands for emergency consultations. The diplomatic machinery was visibly engaged. What the diplomatic language was not doing was accurately representing the operational decisions that had already been made before those statements were drafted. Fleet assets that had been holding position throughout the preceding weeks began receiving orders reflecting a fundamental reassessment of Russia's posture, a shift from indirect support to a direct operational presence that placed Russian military assets in geographic positions where their relationship to the conflict's active theaters was no longer theoretical. Black Sea Fleet components repositioning in the strike's aftermath carried Caliber cruise missile systems whose range from Mediterranean firing positions covered the entire Middle East theater. Their presence in firing positions was itself a communication, a demonstration that Russia had decided the Bushehr strike warranted a response that placed Russian military capability in direct proximity to the conflict in a way that every government with satellite imagery could observe and incorporate into its own calculations. The message was not delivered through a press conference. It was delivered through the movement of vessels carrying systems capable of engaging targets across the theater, positioned in locations from which those systems could reach those targets, operating under orders whose content could be inferred from the positioning even without access to their specific language. Washington's management of the simultaneous demands the Bush airstrike created produced the specific dysfunction that occurs when an alliance partner takes a consequential unilateral action, and the senior partner is left managing consequences it did not choose. The administration was simultaneously trying to maintain the appearance of coordinated Allied decision-making publicly, communicating to Israeli leadership the severity of the strategic miscalculation it believed the strike represented privately, managing Russian communications through back channels operating under maximum pressure, and explaining to domestic audiences why energy prices were being driven by an ally's decision Washington had not authorized. Each demand required messaging in tension with every other demand. Public support for Israel contradicted the private communications Washington was sending, and both contradicted the explanation domestic audiences needed about who was responsible for the economic consequences arriving in their household budgets. Trump's public statements were notable for what they omitted. The unconditional language of ironclad commitment that had historically characterized American public responses to Israeli military operations, regardless of whether Washington had been consulted, was absent in ways that both Israeli and Russian officials were reading carefully. Israel was assessing how much diplomatic cover it could count on. Russia was assessing whether the gap between the commitment's public expression and its operational limits created space for a response that pushed further than Moscow had been willing to go in previous phases. The absence of unconditional language was not a withdrawal of American support, but it was a signal whose ambiguity was being read in both Tel Aviv and Moscow in ways that created genuine uncertainty about what American backing would and would not cover in the specific context of a direct confrontation with Russian military assets. The energy market response to the Bush airstrike compressed into hours what would normally develop across weeks of diplomatic deterioration. Brent crude moved to levels incorporating not just current supply disruption from the Hormuz closure, but forward scenarios, now including Russian naval assets actively operating in proximity to Gulf shipping routes under rules of engagement that were genuinely uncertain. Gas markets moved on the simultaneous assessment that Qatari LNG infrastructure was operating in a threat environment whose dimensions had just expanded in ways the previous week's risk assessments had not incorporated. Dutch TTF natural gas futures climbed to levels that European industrial consumers, already operating at the margin of what elevated energy costs allowed, could not absorb without accelerating production shutdowns that had been proceeding gradually since the conflict began. The insurance dimension amplified the physical supply disruption through the behavioral mechanism that consistently produces energy market consequences faster than any diplomatic response can match. Lloyd's war risk premium adjustments for vessels transiting the Gulf and Arabian Sea moved to levels that changed the economic rationality of individual voyage decisions before any Russian vessel had taken any action against any commercial ship. Shipping companies do not need a tanker sunk to stop routing vessels through a corridor. They need the actuarial calculation to change sufficiently that insurance costs exceed commercial logic. Russian fleet movements following the Bush airstrike were changing that calculation across the entire Gulf region simultaneously, producing supply reduction through behavioral response rather than physical interdiction, at a speed that physical interdiction could not have matched. European energy security planning that had been managing a structural transition away from Russian supply since the Ukraine conflict was now stress testing its assumptions against a scenario whose severity exceeded the planning parameters that transition had been designed around. The Qatari LNG that had become critical to European gas supply security was now operating in an environment where Russian naval presence added a threat dimension that pre-conflict security assessments had not incorporated. German industrial energy costs were already producing factory closures and production relocations at a pace that was generating visible economic damage. The additional price pressure arriving from the Bush escalation was not reaching a system with resilience to absorb it. It was reaching a system already operating at the margin, and the margin had just been eliminated. Gulf state diplomatic responses developed on a timeline reflecting governments making reassessments they had been deferring for weeks, and that the strike's consequences had made impossible to defer further. Saudi Arabia reopened back-channel communications toward Tehran through intermediaries visible enough to be noticed, but deniable enough to preserve the appearance of continued Washington alignment. Communications with Moscow became substantively more engaged, moving from conflict management conversations to conversations reflecting genuine reassessment of what the Russian relationship could provide in the post-Boucher environment. Public statements began omitting formulations that had historically signaled Saudi alignment with American positions on Israeli military operations. Individually, none of these moves constituted a formal break. Together, they constituted a visible positioning shift reflecting a government that had concluded the post-Boucher environment required a different external relationship architecture than the one it had been operating under. China's response operated on dimensions that Western coverage was consistently underweighting. Beijing's public statements maintained carefully neutral language. Its private assessments were considerably less neutral. The Boucher strike had created conditions Chinese strategic planning had modeled as possible, but had not been certain Israel would generate. American attention and political bandwidth committed to managing a direct confrontation between an American ally and Russian military assets in the Middle East simultaneously with Taiwan Strait tensions, Beijing was maintaining at managed elevation. The combination required no Chinese action to generate benefit. It required only accurate observation and positioning to take advantage of the space that American strategic overextension was creating in the Pacific, in global financial relationships, and in the energy architecture whose dollar-denominated stability the escalation was straining. The strategic trap the Boucher strike created for Israel was distinct from the tactical success the strike itself achieved, and that distinction mattered enormously for understanding where the conflict was heading. Tactically, Israeli aircraft had penetrated sophisticated air defense coverage, delivered precision munitions against a hardened target, and demonstrated a capability whose symbolic and strategic significance exceeded any previous Israeli operation in this conflict. The aircraft returned, the mission executed as planned. By the narrow metric of whether the operation achieved its immediate physical objective, it succeeded. The strategic trap operated on a different level entirely. The level at which tactical success generates consequences whose cumulative weight exceeds the value of what the success achieved, and where the options available for managing those consequences are all more expensive than the options that existed before the success was executed. Three interlocking components created the trap. The first was the Russian response dynamic. Moscow had repositioned military assets in direct response to the strike and was operating under internal pressure to demonstrate that repositioning was not theatrical. Russian domestic audiences and the governments watching Moscow's response as a signal about Russian credibility had both received the fleet movements as a promise of meaningful consequence. Backing away from that promise, repositioning the fleet without any visible cost for Israel's strike would communicate to every government calibrating its behavior against Russian credibility that Moscow's guarantees could be violated without consequence. The logic that had created the credibility problem in the first place was now operating in the domain of Russia's response. The response needed to be real enough to restore what the strike had cost, and real enough meant consequential enough to create additional risks that Israel and Washington had to manage simultaneously. The second component was the American alliance management problem. Washington was publicly committed to supporting Israel, privately communicating that the strike was a strategic miscalculation, managing Russian escalation through channels under maximum pressure, and explaining energy price consequences to domestic audiences who were experiencing them without any framework for understanding why Israeli targeting decisions were affecting their household budgets. Each demand generated pressure on the others in ways that prevented any of them from being managed cleanly. The public support commitment constrained how directly Washington could pressure Israel toward de-escalation. The private concern communication contradicted the public support messaging in ways both Israeli and Russian governments were reading and incorporating into their calculations. The Russian escalation management consumed diplomatic bandwidth simultaneously needed for Gulf state reassessments, Asian economic consequences, and allied government concerns about a conflict whose trajectory none of them had modeled when their support was originally extended. The third component was the nuclear dimension the Boucher strike introduced into the conflict's escalatory calculus. Striking a nuclear power plant, regardless of whether the strike targeted the plant's nuclear system specifically, introduced questions about radiation risk, nuclear facility security, and the precedent for treating civilian nuclear infrastructure as legitimate military targets that the international community had been extremely careful to avoid establishing. IAEA emergency protocols activated automatically. Radiation monitoring networks across the region generated data that governments were analyzing against scenarios including cooling system damage and fuel integrity concerns. The specific radiological consequences would take days to establish with confidence, and the uncertainty itself was generating precautionary responses from governments, shipping companies, and insurance markets treating worst-case scenarios as possibilities requiring immediate operational adjustment. The conflict that had been described in its opening days as a limited operation with a defined scope had produced, through a sequence of escalatory decisions, each locally rational given the strategic situation it was responding to, an environment whose complexity exceeded the management capacity of any government whose decisions were determining its trajectory. Israel had calculated Iran's response and incorporated that calculation into its strike authorization. It had not fully calculated Russia's response, or had calculated it and concluded that the strategic situation it was trying to escape was worse than what the Russian response would create. Whether that conclusion was correct was a question the conflict's subsequent trajectory would answer. But the gap between what Israeli planners had modeled and what Russian operational responses were demonstrating was the space in which the conflict's next phase was being determined by people making decisions under pressure that no planning document had fully prepared them for. The Bushehr strike had not broken open a closing strategic situation. It had created a new one whose parameters were more complex, more dangerous, and less manageable than the one it had been designed to escape. Leave one question in the comments. Do you think Israel's strike on Bushehr was a necessary escalation to break a losing strategic trajectory, or the miscalculation that turned a manageable conflict into something nobody can control? Every response gets read. Evidence first, analysis second. You decide what it means. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When Russian naval assets complete their repositioning and their rules of engagement become visible through their actions, when the radiological assessment produces conclusions that change the international response framework, and when the gap between Washington's public positioning and its operational reality becomes impossible to manage through diplomatic language alone, the analysis will be here.